Good morning, everyone from Washington, and thank you for joining us for this Asia Society Policy Institute webinar that will focus on the South Korean elections held earlier this week. My name is Emma Chanlett-Avery. I'm the Director of Political Security Affairs at ASPI and the Deputy Director of the Washington, D.C. office. We have assembled a stellar panel here in order to assess the results of this election and what it means for the U.S.-South Korean relationship, as well as for the broader region. We've published their bios on our website if you'd like to read about all of their accolades, but I'm going to quickly introduce the panelists before providing an overview of what's going on in Seoul. John Delury joins us from Rome, where he is teaching at the American Academy in Rome. He spent many years teaching at U.S University in Seoul. Thanks for joining us from Europe, John. Jina Kim also joins us. She teaches international security at the Language and Diplomacy Division at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, and she also served as chief of the North Korean Military Division at the Korea Institute for Defense Analysis, coming to us from Seoul. Also from Seoul is Dr. Heung-Kyu Kim. He is currently a professor and professor in political science at Ajou University and was the founder of the China Policy Institute. Also in Washington with me is Ellen Kim. She is the Director of Academic Affairs at the Korea Economic Institute. Previously, very recently, she left CSIS, where she was Deputy Director and Senior Fellow at the Korea Chair. Thanks all of you for joining us, and we will get into some deep tissues here in the next hour. So if you are policy inclined enough to log into this webinar so early or so late, as the case may be, you are probably quite aware that earlier this week, Lee Jae-myung was elected by a comfortable margin in the presidential election. He has actually already taken office and facing the challenges of his office. This election, I think, was broadly seen as a referendum on his predecessor, President Yoon Suk-yeol, who was impeached and removed from office after briefly declaring martial law last December. I think this election was also seen by many as a triumph of the democratic process, in that South Korea was able to pull itself out of the chaos and out of the turmoil of the last 6 months and held clean, fair elections with very high, perhaps even record turnout in this election. Now that he's in office, Lee faces a multitude of challenges. Despite the overwhelming victory, there is still a very divided citizenry in South Korea. There is a contracting economy and a bevy of geopolitical issues that he will face. Essentially, after about 6 months of policy paralysis, Lee has to play catch up to the rest of the world. So over the next hour, we are going to explore his options and how his presidency may affect the broader region in the Indo-Pacific. As a reminder to all of our audience, you can submit questions and answers through the Q&A function, and we'll get to those towards the end of this session. So with that capper, let's turn to our panelists. And we are going to start with Professor Kim. Thank you again for joining us so late in this process. Essentially, I want to ask you, has South Korea put this political crisis behind it? And is Lee, do you think, if you can get to this later in your answer, is he going to rule as a pragmatist, or is he going to be more ideological in his approach? Go ahead, Professor Kim.
Okay. First, before I start, let me correct the name of my institute. My institute's name is the U.S. China Policy Institute instead of China Policy Institute. Something wrong there. I think the President Lee would face tremendous challenges in uniting the Korean nations. Because Korea is now heavily divided kind of country. in terms of regions between the East and West, and also gender gaps and generation gaps. And so maybe some of them very value-oriented, mindset, and then some of them very pragmatic. And so even though President Lee declared his foreign and security policies will be based upon the pragmatism instead of some ideology or some value, based some foreign policies. But still, people cast doubt because his people behind him was a kind of people who run a kind of foreign and security policies based upon the some ideologic, like some based some North Korean policies. So still we are not sure, but Lee Jae-myung, he is appointed as chairperson of the National Security Council. He's pragmatist. If Lee Jae-myung will give him a kind of power in running the South Korea's foreign and security policies, maybe Lee Jae-myung's foreign policy can be much more pragmatic than ideology-based, foreign policies.
Are there other posts that have yet to be appointed that might give us some indication of the direction of his administration, other than Lee Jae-myung?
Yeah, there is Lee Jong-seok as a chairperson of the National Intelligence Office. He's a North Korea specialist, and then also he's very familiar with the North Korean cases. So it means Lee Jae-myung may has a certain priority in improving relationship with North Korea. So there are two pillars in his foreign and security policies. First one is improving relationship with North Korea. The other one is running foreign policy in a much more pragmatic ways. It means he will pay special attention to the improving relationship with the United States as well, and not only other countries, but he will place certainly the priority on ROK-US alliance.
Great, thank you for that. I'm going to turn next to John Delury. You've been following politics in Seoul for quite a long time, and I'd like to know sort of your take on the latest developments there, and also, in terms of how you think that Lee will approach his relationships with the United States. Obviously, top of mind is the tariff negotiations right now. If you could address those issues, go ahead.
I'm delighted to join this great group, and I'm always happy to be with the Asia Society and ASPI. It's once again great timing to get the band together. I think as you mentioned in the first comment, this has been a long 6 months for South Korea, and so there's a certain degree of just relief that the vacuum is closed. That took a real toll if you consider how many things have changed in this period of time, and South Korea has just been kind of floating out there in space, and so to have any leader is a really critical step forward. And as you said, I think this is really a moment and will go down in history as a severe challenge to democracy, but one that the public withstood in a pretty remarkable way. So it's a moment of history in that sense. But then as we jump forward into foreign policy and foreign relations and all that, I think if it's fair to say that Lee Jae-myung's first assignment is to figure out what kind of relationship he's going to have with Donald Trump, and what is his strategy going to be for the good of the South Korean economy. It's going to be very difficult, obviously, because while in certain ways Lee Jae-myung is maybe a little better positioned, I think, than either Yoon Suk-yeol or Moon Jae-in, the last two presidents, the conservative one who had this close relationship with Biden that might not have transferred very well into a good relationship with Trump. And before that, Moon Jae-in, another liberal who did work together with Trump, but there was no sign that there was real closeness there. Lee Jae-myung is maybe a little better constructed. I mean, there's a certain brashness to him. He's sometimes been described as Korea's Trump or Korea's Bernie Sanders. I mean, they don't really align in policy, but I think the reason for those labels is that Lee Jae-myung, unlike say Moon Jae-in, there's a kind of roughness to him and a brashness, and it might be easier for Trump to sort of sit down and be like, okay, I get this guy. You know, maybe I'm still going to give him a hard time on trade and tariffs, but they might be able at that leader to leader level to establish a little bit better rapport. So I'm very cautiously optimistic that Lee Jae-myung can figure out how to get a kind of sit down with Trump. But you know, still, South Korea is going to be in the crosshairs as far as the trade imbalance. And even if things go all right in the meetings between the two men, that doesn't mean that, you know, a tweet or a truth social, whatever it is, post comes out and throws the whole thing off. So, you know, in that sense, Lee Jae-myung faces the same kind of uncertainty that world leaders here in Europe and really everywhere are facing.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of interest in when they will actually schedule a leader-to-leader meeting. That will be important for setting the tone. But right now, there's been sort of much made about the fact that Trump did single out South Korea in the State of the Union for its unfair trade practices. And I think that Secretary Hegseth and Shangri-La recently really didn't mention Korea very much. So those are just some indicators that Lee really needs to make himself known as a leader directly with Trump. So thanks for that. Let's go to Jina Kim now. Thanks for joining, and I'd love to sort of get your take too on how you think the new Korean administration will prioritize these issues with the United States. And I think it's worth noting that Lee's party also has a supermajority in the National Assembly, I believe. So they really have a lot of control over the direction of policy in this administration. So how do you see the Democratic Party sort of taking the reins now?
All right. Thank you for having me today for this very timely discussion. Before and after the election, some observers argue that a progressive government is likely to inherit the broad contours of the earlier progressive government. But the foreign policy of South Korea's new progressive government should be, I think, assessed not merely in terms of continuity with the past governments, but how the new leadership interprets the evolving international order and redefines South Korea's role and articulates its national interest within a pragmatic framework that Professor Kim already mentioned. The Democratic Party has consistently articulated a pragmatic and realistic approach to foreign affairs, emphasizing national interest as the guiding principle. So during the presidential campaign, many experts actually contributed to shaping President Lee's foreign policy vision within the Democratic Party's election committee, which I was part of. While these individuals came from diverse backgrounds and held very different priorities, but we actually worked together as a single team to reconcile differences and forge a coherent policy directions. And notably, there are no divergence of opinion within the Democratic Party regarding the importance of the ROK-U.S. alliance. And in fact, when it comes to strengthening the alliance, there is little discernible policy gap now between the Democratic Party and the People's Power Party. And in his inauguration speech on Wednesday, President Lee reaffirmed his commitment to reinforcing trilateral cooperation among South Korea, the U.S., and Japan, and creating a very strong ROK-U.S. alliance. And he also emphasized robust deterrence based on the alliance to counter North Korean threats. And these statements signal continuity in institutionalized cooperation established by the previous government, particularly regarding extended deterrence. President Lee envisions the alliance evolving into a comprehensive partnership encompassing not only defense, but also economic, technological, and global challenges such as climate change and human rights. So Lee has also called for a very comprehensive negotiation with the US in areas like energy, defense burden sharing, and shipbuilding. And during his campaign trail, he repeatedly mentioned enhancing South Korea's shipbuilding competitiveness through modernization, positioning shipbuilding and MRO which is the U.S. interest as well, as key sector for mutually beneficial cooperation. So I think what we can expect is probably deepening strategic dialogue with the U.S. to expand and strengthen defense industrial cooperation. Well, the new government's emphasis on enhancing South Korea's strategic autonomy needs due attention, though. The party platform suggests upgrading the performance of Korean ballistic missile systems and modernizing the national missile defense architecture. And it also emphasized completing the transfer of wartime operational control, which underscores South Korea's intent to assume greater responsibility for its own defense posture. It will require certainly close consultation between the two allies because it is a very, very complex issue. But the pursuit of advancing indigenous military capability can provide also new opportunities for the two allies, in my opinion, because South Korea can assume more responsibilities and contributions to regional peace and stability. So I think this is, well, hopefully this is good news for us.
Thanks for that overview, Gina, and I agree that shipbuilding is sort of a possible area of greater cooperation. If I can press you a little bit on how there are different camps within the DP because they have such control, both from from the presidency and the National Assembly. How would you characterize, or I welcome another panelist to jump in here too, how there are ideological divisions within the DP?
Well, there are certainly people with different ideas, and that certainly came out during the election campaign. But what is truly important is the idea coming from the President Lee, because everybody will follow that guideline. So I think, after all, his policy direction will guide the direction of the policy of each government bodies, after all, I think.
It's all about party discipline always, right? So we'll see how that plays out in the years to come. Let's turn to Ellen now. From your perch here in Washington, what has been the reaction from the United States of Lee's election? And how do you think, either publicly or privately, and what do you think that the Trump administration ultimately wants from South Korea, other than, of course, a reduction of the deficit?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to join this wonderful panel to talk about the very timely issue on South Korea's election. So the general overall reaction here in Washington is that there was no big surprise in the outcome of this election. President Lee had been consistently leading the in the polls since the beginning of the campaign. So many Korean watchers have been thought that President Lee had a very high chance of winning, and thus have been following very closely about his foreign policy positions, particularly about his emphasis on pragmatic diplomacy. With regard to your question about what the Trump administration wants from South Korea, I mean, there are a lot of things, but I would just say that there is an expectation and desire in Washington that the United States wants South Korea to play and be a more responsible and reliable ally and partner. That's a widely held view in Washington, not my personal view. I should also note that this perspective is a bipartisan and also not exclusive to the Trump administration. During the Biden administration, U.S. government officials also frequently expressed their desire and also encouraged South Korea to play a more active role in the regional and global affairs, in line with South Korea's economic and military capability, also in line with its South Korea's global cultural influence. So, but under the Trump administration, this expectation has taken a more like a transactional form. We can see that from President Trump's recent call for South Korea to, pay more fair share of defense spending, and also to be more fair on the trade and stuff like that. But nonetheless, this call for South Korea and also other allies, not to mention, to contribute more to the global international security, I think has been a consistent trend across successive U.S. administrations.
Great, thank you, Ellen. Let's branch out and talk a little bit more about the region and about foreign policy under the Lee administration. Jina, I'm going to turn back to you and for your sort of assessment of where South Korea's foreign policy goes from here. Particularly, I'd like you to talk about Seoul's concern that the United States is shifting so much focus to China and to a possible contingency with Taiwan or in the Taiwan Straits, that it will degrade in some way its commitment on the peninsula.
Yes, regarding China-US competition, from South Korea's perspective, the US has increasingly politicized foreign policy to gain some domestic support under the America First agenda. And at the same time, Washington seems to make strategic efforts to enhance its bargaining power in long-term geopolitical competition. And these trends suggest that the US-China rivalry is unlikely to be resolved in the near future and will likely persist as a prolonged confrontation. So in this context, South Korea is in position to carefully navigate a path that preserves a strategic alignment with the US while managing complex regional dynamics, particularly its relationship with China. While the previous government pursued a value-based partnership aligning with like-minded states to counterbalance China, this strategic framework now calls for some kind of review. Given South Korea's strategic position between the US and China, the new government is expected to adopt a risk mitigation strategy. South Korea's economic interdependence with China, it does not go away, including exposure to secondary sanctions and export controls. And President Lee emphasizes that diplomacy should improve South Korean citizens' daily lives. So to this end, he advocates selective engagement, cooperating with both powers based on issue areas to minimize economic fallout on domestic industries. The new government is thus expected to pursue mutually beneficial ROK-US alliance development while simultaneously pursuing mature relations with China. Well, the U.S. prioritization of China strategy has two key implications, in my opinion. First, it elevates the strategic value of allies in the Indo-Pacific, making alliance management a critical component of U.S. foreign policy. As long as South Korea remains committed to alliance development, it will continue to be regarded as a vital and closely managed ally by Washington. Second, the U.S. has shown increasing interest in allied contributions to regional contingencies. And President Lee has yet to articulate a clear position on South Korea's potential role in crises such as Taiwan Strait conflict, because it's a very, very sensitive issue in South Korea. Well, this issue is closely tied not only to the role of South Korean forces, but also to the strategic flexibility and expanded mission scope mission of the U.S. Forces Korea, USFK. So given that stake, the US and South Korea will need to engage in deeper policy consultations to clarify each expectations. And my personal view is, well, avoiding the issue altogether is not a sustainable option. From a national interest perspective, the new government is likely to assess this question through the lens of risk management, especially in terms of how regional contingencies could directly or indirectly impact the Korean Peninsula. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. John, let's talk more about the Lee's strategy for engagement with the DPRK. Love to hear your views on how he might differ from the Yoon administration or even from his predecessors in terms of how he reach out to North Korea. Pyongyang probably not offering a lot of runway and has been fairly intransigent the last couple of years. Let's get your take.
Certainly, he's going to approach things very differently from the Yoon administration. We can start with that. They don't share, there's areas of continuity, but this is a clear divergence. It's one of the few things you can count on to separate, liberal progressives versus conservatives in a South Korean context, is they're going to approach North Korea differently. So it'll be more continuity. I think that his team, even though it's different personnel, there's continuity with all the way back to the Sunshine Policy, actually, and generally the philosophy and strategy among liberals in South Korea that engagement, negotiation, dialogue is the way to approach North Korea, not sanctions and not a more sort of hostile posture. So I think that Lee Jae-myung is certainly going to look. And with someone like Lee Jung-suk in the intelligence, heading the intelligence, that's kind of a clear signal that the back channel is open and that Seoul does want to get the dialogue restarted with Pyongyang in a way that the Yoon administration was really just not interested. I think the key is going to be, and I wrote about this in a piece that is fresh up with Foreign Affairs, is how, from Lee Jae-myung's perspective, how he can sort of use the opportunity that Trump presents. Because we know that Donald Trump enjoyed meeting with Kim Jong-un. And Trump has made comments suggesting he's not really putting a lot of energy into it. But he has suggested, yeah, I have a great relationship with him, and we kind of need to get back to that. So, I think there really is a window of opportunity here for the old metaphor was the driver's seat, for Lee Jae-myung to try to hop in the driver's seat. It's going to be arguably even harder than the situation Moon Jae-in faced because of the relationship with Russia, because of the fact that rather than a sort of ambivalent partnership that North Korea always has with China, there's actually a very robust military and economic alliance that's kind of blossoming with Russia. So it's going to be very hard to pry that apart enough to get the channels open. But I expect Lee Jae-myung to try. And I think that while Kim Jong-un just talking to Seoul would not be enough, I do think that Kim Jong-un will be interested in seeing his old pal Donald again, even if it's for the theater of it. So, I think in the next 6 months, that's where we're headed. And it's a question of how much substance the diplomacy can have. And I think the substance is really up to Lee Jae-myung. Donald Trump can handle the theatrics, but Lee and the Lee administration is going to have to provide the nitty gritty and the details and the hard work.
Yeah, I tend to agree that I think that President Trump sees this as unfinished business from his first term. But of course, it's a radically different landscape strategically than it was during his first term. So there must be a fairly acute concern in Seoul that, Donald Trump goes directly to Kim Jong-un. without really consulting or managing the relationship with South Korea. And North Korea seems to not be responding to South Korean politics like we once expected it to. So I imagine, that there are risks for Seoul, given that Trump does have this personal relationship with Kim Jong-un. But how does the Lee government try and avoid being marginalized?
I'd like to hear from both Professors Kim who are in Seoul for sort of the feeling there, the concern. It's a perennial concern, Korea passing on one issue set or the other. I think when it comes to North Korea, I don't know. If you're Lee Jae-myung, it's not the worst thing in the world if Donald Trump can reopen the line with Kim Jong-un. I think that actually is enough in the direction of the policy that they'd like to go in, that it's really fine. And we saw that with Moon Jae-in. Moon Jae-in was okay with sometimes moving into the back seat, so long as there was a process where there was tension reduction, there was positive movement in 1819. And Moon Jae-in kind of swallowed his pride from time to time, and it was obvious that it was really about Trump and Kim, but it was moving the relationship, and it was moving North Korea in a direction that's basically in South Korea's interest. So I don't think it's really the worst thing in the world if Trump and Kim move forward. I think the problem is Trump just does not have the focus on it. I mean, he did have a much bigger focus in his first term. It was kind of his pet issue for a while. And we're seeing he's got a lot of issues. He's focused on. North Korea is really not that high on the list anymore. So that's why I think it's a little less likely that it will start without South Korea being involved.
Yeah, we have a lot of tariff negotiations to get through here. So watch this space. Professor Kim, returning to you, we need to talk about China specifically, and about South Korea's relationship with China under the Lee administration. And if you could also address how Russia's deepening partnership with China affects this calculus.
Okay. We have a strategic cooperative partnership established in 2008. But I do not think the relationship between South Korea and China is strategic, and also not really cooperative, and it's not partnership. So it doesn't work, So China has a certain anticipation to improve the relationship between these two countries after Lee Jae-myung became president of South Korea. But the relationship between these two countries is not necessary to be always cooperative, and but historically, the history of Korea's, and then we got the foreign invasion around 1,000 times throughout our history. About 450 times coming from the north, which is China. So China has been always the kind of existential threat to Korean people. So we have very special DNA, and no matter North Korea or South Korea is. So there is a very special attention to Chinese every inch of moves. So even though people are saying there are a kind of alliance between North Korea and China, but I do not think the North Korea really fear China is a real alliance of the North Korea. And now North Korea has a quite different position from the past, which is in Trump first Trump era. North Korea has a kind of military relationship alliance with Russia, and also Chinese backup. So North Korea is much stronger, position now. So I do not think they are really interested in the kind of negotiation with the United States, even with South Korea. But anyway, Lee Jae-myung government will place a kind of priority to improve the relationship with the North Korea. So that's why he appointed Lee Jong-seok as a chairperson of the National Intelligence Office. We will try. Maybe Trump will try also to have a negotiation with the North Korea. But I have a very cautious pessimism. North Korea has no really interest in negotiation with United States and as well as the Lee Jae-myung's governments. So there's a difficulties, and but Lee Jae-myung also tried to improve the relationship with China, but also I have a cautious pessimism on that. And then there are so many issues arising now between South Korea and China, and then I do not think there is a real quick solution between these two countries. And also Chinese internal situations are not really stable, especially the relationship between the Chinese military and the Chinese leadership, including the Xi Jinping, and also elite politics in China. Now there are several signs coming out, and then so we carefully watching over Chinese the moves inside, and but China, of course, plays a kind of priority in improving the relationship with South Korea. Whenever China got some difficulties with the great powers, they place priority on neighboring foreign policies. So that's why they want to improve the relationship with South Korea and Japan, maybe also the other neighboring countries. So they are working very hard now, but the problem is Chinese idea doesn't turn out to be as quite something we can see in their actions. So there are differences between their what they're saying and what they did. So China must prove themselves how they provide the kind of public goods for the people in the region and the people for the rest of the world. So it's going to be quite difficult because also internal problems of what China now has.
Thanks for that. Just to follow up a little bit.
Okay.
I think that traditionally, South Korea has maintained a stronger relationship with China, somewhat because it depends on China for its North Korea policy too. North Korea is in a little bit of a different place now. It has more leverage, largely because of its partnership with Russia. So China doesn't have all that much control, or maybe they never did have as much control as we assumed over Pyongyang. So do you think that Seoul still remains pretty dependent on Beijing for managing this relationship with North Korea, or has the landscape shifted?
Yeah, some of them must be the quite relying upon the China in dealing with the North Korea, but I do not think that's the quite wise, and because now North Korea's position, as I mentioned already, moved out of our orbit. So and also North Korea possesses the nuclear weapons, so they would not listen to the Chinese advice or Chinese guidance, and they have their own interest. So China is fully aware of the North Korea's the kind of behaviors, and so even though there are strategic interests shared together, but still North Korea has their own. So it's extremely difficult for China to have a kind of control or influence over North Korea. So this is going to be much more difficult now. So, but the problem is in the past, South Korea depends on China because of the stability on the Korean Peninsula, maybe Chinese role, positive role. But in this period, I do not think we can expect often the kind of Chinese role. China has very limited role. But the problem is the cost China can cause upon the South Korea. So especially in the year of strategic competition between U.S. and China. So if United States force South Korea to choose one side, and then the cost is going to be maybe outweigh the benefits of the alliance. That's the problem. And so we have to find a kind of solution, because South Korea pursue a kind of regional stability as well as strategic stability. Means that we don't want any power rapidly change the balance of power or balance of interest in this region. So we need the United States. So the cooperation with the United States, even for the Lee Jae-myung governments, is kind of not a choice, but a necessity. But the problem is Trump administration how to respond to the kind of necessity for South Korea's national and then interest and security. So there is a kind of discrepancies between the South Korea and United States. So we have to resolve the issues.
Great, thank you. Let's go to Ellen now and talk about another power in the neighborhood, and that's Japan. Lee made some statements during the campaign that he recognized the importance of cooperation with Japan. But of course, traditionally, progressive governments in Seoul have not been as warm with Tokyo. So how do you see the Lee administration managing its relationships with Japan? And in that same vein, how do you see the trilateral partnership, U.S., South Korea, Japan, developing?
Yes. So as you said, Emma, President Lee campaigned on a centrist platform. However, because his foreign policy positions during the campaign sort of contradicted remarks he had made in the past, there are some people who have some questions or sort of maintaining a sort of wait and see mode on his approach toward Japan and U.S. ROK, Japan trilateral cooperation. Of course, campaigning is one thing and governing is another thing. And so it will be interesting to see how Lee transition out of the campaign mode and more importantly, whom he appoints as his foreign policy advisors. Having said that, though, I expect that President Lee will try to maintain current stable relations with Japan because number one, as Professor Jina Kim mentioned, his emphasis on national interest. And Japan is a critical partner for South Korea's economy, which is his Lee government's top priority right now. And public sentiment in South Korea toward Japan is relatively positive recently, so, and especially among the younger generations. And Ambassador Ri Sung-nak, who President Lee recently appointed as a national security advisor, understands well about the importance of Japan for South Korea. However, all of this will, the stable relationship between Korea and Japan, I think will depend on how historical and territorial issues will remain contained. As President Lee made very clear, he's likely take a very firm and principled approach toward those issues. So I think that those, so overall, I think President Lee's will likely to take a two-track approach for Japan. One is to strengthen cooperation in economy, social, and cultural spheres, whereas he will respond more strongly on the historical and the territorial disputes. On the U.S. ROK Japan trilateral cooperation, I think President Lee is going to continue to support U.S. ROK Japan trilateral cooperation. He made it very clear that U.S. ROK alliance is the foundation of the U.S. ROK South Korea's foreign policy. However, there are some risks, I think, and one is that U.S. Korea-Japan's bilateral relationship will be weaker than it will be, especially when the U.S. is not paying attention to it, it's not engaged on it. And another risk is when this deepening trilateral cooperation could complicate Lee government's desire to improve relations with the North Korea and China. And in that case, there could be, as the Lee government tried to recalibrate its approach to China, I think that this could maybe give incentive to Lee government to, recalibrate some of its approach to trilateral cooperation.
Yeah, I think you point out the really conflicting pressures of sort of wanting to improve relationships with everyone around them when there are deep geopolitical divisions here. And of course, Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba, while he's been generally friendly to the idea of the trilateral and better relations with South Korea, he also has an election coming up for the upper house this summer, so probably is facing some pressure there as well. Is your sense that the United States is sort of less likely to pay attention to this trilateral partnership and less likely to adhere to the principles that were laid out in the Camp David Accords? And if so, if that's the case, do you think that Seoul and Tokyo have a recognition that the stakes are so high for them in the Indo-Pacific that they can keep that leg, at least that link between Seoul and Tokyo, a little bit more firm and friendly?
Yeah. So I think that I mean, given that there is no government in South Korea, there has been little discussions coming from the Trump administration about the trilateral cooperation until very recently, I think. And as we saw yesterday, I think Secretary of State Mark Rubio actually mentioned about U.S. intent to continue to strengthen the U.S. ROK Japan trilateral cooperation. And in fact, that if you talk to some of the U.S. officials from the first Trump administration, they insist that they're the one who actually built the foundation of the U.S. ROK Japan trilateral cooperation. So I think that there will be some boost in efforts to reinvigorate the U.S. ROK Japan trilateral cooperation, regardless of whether this is maybe. I mean, they will try to rebrand it in some way as if it's their own initiative, apart from the Camp David Accord. But as for the U.S. Korea Japan, I think that it all depends on how both countries can contain the historical and territorial disputes. Even if U.S. remain engaged in trilateral cooperation, I think that is I think the really issue that could actually undermine the bilateral relationship between Seoul and Tokyo, given President Lee's position on those.
Great, thank you, Ellen, for that. I'm going to go to a couple of questions that have come in over the course of the last couple minutes, and a reminder to our audience that you're welcome to submit questions in the Q&A function here. Here's one. The DPRK remains a critical threat, with its expanded nuclear arsenal posing an increased risk to both regional and global security. If future U.S.-North Korea negotiations focus only on ICBMs and leave short-range missiles, pressure within South Korea to develop its own nuclear deterrent could escalate. So how should South Korea navigate future U.S. DPRK negotiations, and what are the implications if it moves toward a domestic nuclear capability? The panel knows, of course, that there has been at least increased appetite within the South Korean public for developing its own nuclear arsenal. So I'm going to welcome anyone from the panel to comment on this because it's a live issue. Should we turn to John first, see if you have thoughts on that?
I mean, I think we'll see. I would anticipate that the South Korean public is going to appear less fervent about wanting nukes now that the government doesn't share that priority. You know, I think a lot of what we saw in the last few years was from the president himself kind of stoking the fires of this idea and articulating, you know, bringing it into the public sphere of, oh, maybe we need a nuclear weapon, and really moving the discourse forward. I wait to stand corrected by Professors Kim and Kim who are there, but in my experience in South Korea, if you really wanted, you could get a poll to say 70% of South Koreans want nuclear weapons. But it's only when you don't give them the context of what that means, when you don't put it in a list of priorities, you know, of what South Koreans want. So I'm frankly really skeptical of the idea that South Koreans are moving in that direction. I think that with a more responsible administration that is not trying to encourage that, it's going to naturally quiet down significantly. And as far as, I mean, this is kind of a similar scenario, Emma, to what you suggested. If there's movement in Trump-Kim discussions of, at minimum, it would be a test moratorium. I mean, Kim Jong-un is not going to start decommissioning all his ICBMs, even for Donald Trump. So what are we talking about? We're talking about realistically something addressing the ICBM testing is probably what's on the boards. I mean, that doesn't radically change security for South Korea. So the idea that if the United States and DPRK start working on an arrangement to create greater transparency or reduce the threat of a use of ICBMs, again, that redounds to the benefit more of South Korea's security rather than undermining it. If what we see is Donald Trump, taking the wrecking ball to the alliance and saying, okay, we need to pull out 5,000 troops if I don't get $5 billion, that's really the danger that I would be concerned about, as opposed to progress in negotiations over ICBMs.
Jina, go ahead.
Let me add something else. I already told you that what the president thinks is important, and Democratic Party wants to show that it is different from PPP. So the new government firmly rejects the pursuit of indigenous nuclear armament, viewing such a path as fundamentally incompatible with South Korea's strategic and diplomatic priorities. And President Lee already mentioned that developing nuclear weapons would not only weaken the global non-proliferation regime, but also erode the foundational trust and strategic coherence of the ROK-US alliance. And he warned that if South Korea were to pursue nuclear weapons, it could trigger a regional chain reaction, prompting other states in this region to consider similar capabilities, thereby accelerating a nuclear arms race and heightening regional instability. And he believes peace serves national interest, so he wants regional stability anyway. Instead, the new government intends to reinforce South Korea's national defense posture by investing in advanced conventional military capabilities. So extended deterrence continues to serve as a central pillar of South Korea's security architecture. That's my view.
Thank you for that additional perspective. This panel is obviously focused largely on security issues and foreign policy, but as our Q&A list indicates, there's such tremendous pressure on the trade negotiations right now, and how the Lee administration, now that they're in place, are going to deal with these pretty intense tariffs that they have put on them. So I welcome anyone on the panel to comment on either what approach you think that the Lee administration takes, what sort of leverage that it offers in terms of approaching these negotiations, and are they considering things like additional investment in the United States, despite the fact that they already have fairly high levels of FDI? Any consideration, for example, to the Alaskan pipeline, that they could provide LNG to the region? That is the overwhelming concern and the overwhelming issue between the two countries right now. Kim, do you have any additional perspective that you can offer other than what you have already offered to us today?
In the previous years, the relationship between South Korea and China was complementary, because South Korea has a middle level of technologies and then items, manufacturers, and then we provide these to China, and China make products and then sell to the world. So this is a kind of a perfect a model to develop, and then, but now the model was broken down, and the China became too much competitive, and then we cannot compete with China. And but still, we are heavily dependent upon our trade with China, maybe 1/4 of our GDP. So this is the new, a year of challenges because United States tried to decouple from Chinese and then especially in the area of strategic the technologies and then also some items. Basically, South Korea won't have stable the supply chains with the United States, and also we want to continue to have some trade relationship with China with basic items because this is the kind of most efficient cost and benefit the trade relationship with China. So we cannot just simply leave out of the trade with China. So that's the reality. But the problem is the United States, if force South Korea to invest more or move our industries to the United States at the sacrifice of South Korea's economy. And then the problem is if South Korea's economy would collapse, then we cannot maintain the alliance because we don't have any resources to support the alliance. So we have to find the kind of better solution how we help each other and how to make the much more stable supply chains between the United States and South Korea, because South Korea's whole national identity and then also our values basically learn from the United States, and then also the Korean people love the United States actually, and the United States. Any country in the world call United States a beautiful country in interpretation, and there are only few. So, so still we Korean people, the United States is beautiful, but the problem is now the new trade policies and then also some policies in foreign policies not beautiful as South Koreans before we believed, and so there are tremendous pressure and then challenges coming from the United States. But the United States seems not as sensitive as we feel the kind of threat or some crisis in the relationship between the United States and South Korea. So we have to care each other, and then otherwise we cannot really deal with China. China is very good at handling this kind of cleavages. And then also China has a long history of statecrafts and then also some tactics and then strategies. And then their strategies, their culture are quite different from those of Western cultures. But Westerners are not really familiar with, but South Koreans are very familiar with Chinese, the kind of. So we have to help, and then we need, as I mentioned, the regional stability as well as strategic stability. Means we need the United States. If United States only pursue America first, only America, then you cannot sustain and the alliance in the Northeast Asia. Then eventually South Korea will make a decision to go for nuclear. But as long as the United States remain, as long as United States is powerful, as long as United States reasonable, then we will support the United States, definitely.
Thank you. Wrapping up many of the issues that we've covered so far. I want to ask one last question as we near the end of this hour, and it's sort of going back to the election itself that was just held on Tuesday, and asking if are there any surprises about the generational or gender gaps or geographic gaps in who voted for Lee and who voted for Kim. I think that these generational and gender gaps were really prevalent in Yoon's election. And I wonder if any of you, perhaps Jina, since you're on the ground there in Seoul, have noticed any trend or something notable about the breakdown in the electorate.
I could see a gap in generations. That the older generation supports PPT and the younger generation supports DP up to 50s. So there was a very clear gap in the age. That's one thing that I could see. And we had not only candidates from DP and PPP, there was a third person, Lee Jae-myung, who gathered lots of the votes from young male voters. So that's another new phenomena that we could see.
Great. That's helpful just to see how this played out. We have reached the end of the hour. I really appreciate the panelists for providing this rich and broad ranging set of perspectives. And stay tuned. Watch this space because there's going to be a lot of action coming out of Seoul, and we'll see if the predictions made here will actually play out. Thanks to everyone for tuning in to this webinar. Thanks to the panelists once again for joining us, and we look forward to engaging more on this front.